Kia ora. Okay. Let me just get these links up on our page. A link. So I'm just going to blah, blah, blah while I wait. Give it a few minutes. Sorry, I'm late, everybody. We usually do have these readings at 7 o'clock. I'd asked for a little bit of time tonight to push it back a bit because we did have our marae hui tonight to talk about the landfill. People might have seen on the news that that recent storms had opened up a landfill on our river mouth, and so we started to talk about we've started the community discussions around how we want to what we want to do with the landfill over the next 5 years and then moving into the future as well. Great turnout for the community, interesting discussions, interesting pathway we're moving ahead on, and yeah, looking forward to getting some better things in place for our community around our waste. So, okay. So tonight, tonight I am going to be reading from Ani Mikaere. Ani Mikaere is one of my favorite authors. So already in this series of readings, if this is your first time joining us, and thank you very much to our Patreon community who support me to do this mahi, I should say straight up. You are awesome, and our Patreon community have also said that they're sweet for these readings to just go public for everyone, whether you're a member of Patreon or not. And so I just really want to acknowledge everybody for doing that. Took us a while also to figure out what was the right platform to be able to do that on. Turns out that it's Zoom plus YouTube, which I can post the link up anywhere if I do it that way. So yeah, tonight's so in the past few weeks we have heard from Ibram Kendi, Kahinda Andrews. We've heard from Ijoma Ulo, Arundhati Roy. Last week was Arundhati Roy as well. And so this week we're going to bring it on home, our anti-racism reading, and one of my favorite, she's always inspired me, a really powerful writer, a really insightful and unrepentant writer, Ani Mikaere. And the book that I'm reading from of hers is called He Rukuruku Whakaaro. And it's a collection of her essays. If you don't have this book, thoroughly recommend you read it. I'll put the link down below and post it on my Patreon and Facebook as well. So chapter 4, out of He Rukuruku Whakaaro by Ani Mikaere. And this chapter, this essay is called Racism in contemporary Aotearoa a Pākehā problem. I understand that much of the research done in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder has focused on the trauma suffered by the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust of World War II. I also understand the same has been done with the Vietnam veterans. What seems not to have received similar attention is the Holocaust suffered by Indigenous people, including Māori, as a result of colonial contact and behaviour. The furor that this simple statement of fact by Tariana Turia, Associate Minister of Māori Affairs, caused in Aotearoa tells us a great deal about the chasm between Māori and Pākehā realities. As far as Māori were concerned, there was nothing new or surprising in what Turia was saying. While estimates of the Māori population prior to contact with our colonisers vary from 500,000 to 200,000, nobody disputes that by 1896, barely 50 years after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it had reached an all-time low of just over 42,000. Turia could scarcely be accused of exaggeration in her characterization of an 80% population decline as genocide. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century, confident predictions by various Pākehā public figures that Māori, faced with the inherent superiority of the civilized white, would die out altogether, provided welcome news to many settlers faced with Māori opposition to land sales with active Māori resistance. With active Māori resistance to increasing European encroachment. History tells us that Māori have suffered considerably as a result of Pākehā contact, and that racism has been pivotal to the way in which Pākehā have conducted themselves in our country. Despite the fact that Māori have suffered and continue to suffer a great deal as a result of Pākehā racism, racism in Aotearoa is, however, still essentially a Pākehā problem. Pākehā people carry an enormous burden of guilt about the way in which they have come to occupy their present position of power and privilege. They also have a deep-rooted insecurity about the illegitimacy of the state that they have attempted to create on Māori land. Pākehā have developed a range of strategies to deal with these uncomfortable truths. One such strategy is the art of selective amnesia, which reveals itself in an apparent ability to conveniently forget vast chunks of history as and when it suits. Another is the denial and distortion of the truth, for example, insisting that colonization was overwhelmingly a positive experience for Māori. The obsession with looking forward also typifies this stance, indicating a desperate fear of being confronted with the consequences of what has been done in the past. Perhaps the most extraordinary tactic, however, is the Pākehā determination to assume the mantle of victimhood. For example, by complaining that any initiative designed to assist Māori communities constitutes an unjustifiable assault on Pākehā rights. I have felt this in the past few days, I can tell you. Well, I've felt it for a long time, but particularly the last couple of days. The full array of these strategies was on display in the days immediately following Turia's speech. Despite the head of the Psychological Society's public statement that the speech had been entirely appropriate in the context of the occasion, public and media reaction was immediate and extreme. Over 30 complaints were lodged with the Race Relations Conciliator, accusing Turia of inciting racial disharmony. Leader of the opposition, Jenny Shipley, called on the Prime Minister to censure her minister immediately, insisting that her comments have the potential to cause huge division and seriously damage race relations in New Zealand. Before I read any further, I just want to point out and remind everybody that while I'm reading about what Jenny Shipley did to Tariana Turia over speaking this truth about race relations in Aotearoa, the person we're talking about is also the patron for the Cook celebrations last year, the anniversary celebrations last year. Anyway, Shipley's sudden concern for the state of race relations was somewhat ironic in view of her own racist outburst barely 3 months earlier, during a parliamentary debate on the government's proposal to sell radio frequencies to Māori at a 5% discount in order to help reduce disparities between Māori and non-Māori. Shipley had asked, "Where is the 5% discount for Pacific Island people if they are actually causing trouble as well? They climb in the windows of other New Zealanders at night. It's not only Māori." This comment revealed as much about Pākehā New Zealand's obsession with home invasion as it did about Shipley's racist belief in a Polynesian prevalence for criminal activity. In a breathtaking display of the selective amnesia previously referred to, Shipley continued, "While all political parties, in my experience, are genuinely committed to closing the gaps that exist in health, welfare, education, and employment, this won't be achieved by rewriting history." The Prime Minister took the extraordinary step of ordering Turia not to use the word Holocaust again when describing what happened to Māori during colonisation. Unsurprisingly, this command gave rise to accusations that the Prime Minister was gagging free speech in much the same way that Hitler had done before her. Now, isn't that something? When we want to have some level of response around these right-wing, alt-right speakers coming to Aotearoa, I called them fascist Ken and Barbie. What were their names? Lauren Southern. I can't even remember the guy's name. Bald dude. But yeah, all of the free speech people came out. The protests and the threats. Where was Dave Seymour and ACT when free speech became an issue around Tariana Turia, when the government decided to gag her from calling it what it was? It was a Holocaust. It was genocide. An 80% reduction, population drop is easily qualifies as genocide. Anyway, to continue, the response of Pākehā politicians, media and public to a simple truth about the genocidal impact of colonisation on Indigenous peoples typifies the fear and overreaction that usually accompanies any interpretation of events other than the one that sustains their own shaky foundations. As a legal academic who spent many years educating Pākehā law students about how their legal system came to dominate in Aotearoa, I had encountered similar reactions all too regularly. It was bad enough that these students came to university without having been taught the most basic of historical facts about the imposition of British law in Aotearoa. Their ignorance meant that it was left to me to teach them history that they should have been exposed to as a matter of course whilst at school. But what made it much worse was that the students appeared to hold me responsible for the guilt that they felt at learning about what their ancestors had done to mine. Complaints to the dean that Pākehā students were being made to feel culturally unsafe in class were not uncommon. Patricia Montour Angus, a Mohawk legal academic who had similar experiences to my own whilst teaching in Canadian law schools, rejected the notion that she should silence herself for the sole purpose that the oppressor will not feel badly, adding that trying to force me to be responsible is a powerful tool intended to silence. I mean, this is, you know, and this is the experience we have. It's been a really interesting 48-ish hours. A little last week, I was interviewed by a fantastic outfit, Happen Films, and they have a strong following both here and overseas. And we talked about, Antoinette wanted to chat with me about my journey of plastic resistance, looking at environmental racism and issues like oil and plastics as a form of colonization, but particularly given that it's Plastic Free July, looking at this intersection of colonization and plastics, and how plastics colonize places and spaces and bodies. And so we had a chat, and then she messaged me a little while later when it went up on their YouTube page to say, Tina, there's been some really interesting comments underneath. I checked it out and I had to laugh, because we had people talking about how Māori were not the first people in Aotearoa, the Patu Paerehe were, and the inference that it was actually Europeans, and then Māori wiped the Europeans out, but the first peoples were actually European. Anyway, it's a conspiracy theory that is really popular, I want to say, in new age groups. And then subsequent to that, it was shared on Facebook on a page called Permaculture in New Zealand, or New Zealand Permaculture. And oh my goodness, did it trigger a lot of people. Wow. Did it trigger a lot of people. And I actually thanked them, because it is really hard sometimes. And I was having this discussion in the context of the Green Party earlier on in the week as well. It's really hard to get across to people the distinct racism that you experience within liberal spaces, liberal communities, and how difficult it is to have that discussion when people have this sense of righteousness due to their environmentalism. They believe that they can't possibly be racist because they love the earth, and New Agers as well are particularly adverse to examining their own racism. And so they bury it under these cloaks, but it's just the same racism as what we find in corporate boardrooms and halls of parliament or council chambers. It's just cloaked in green usually, rather than whatever the other colors are. And so it can be a really frustrating space for Indigenous people to work in. But the virulent racism, the extreme racism, I should say, that came out through the comments on either YouTube or Facebook under that interview were really an exquisite demonstration of liberal racism, and really highlighted the fact that just because people love putting their hands in the soil doesn't mean that they're committed to healthy relationships or social justice. And so that saves me a whole lot of trouble trying to explain that to people. Now I just need to direct them to those pages or talk about those experiences, and it's a perfect demonstration of what we're talking about. It's one of the reasons why a lot of Indigenous people don't feel safe and don't engage in non-Indigenous environmental causes or spiritual causes or whatnot. So and yeah, usually the same tools, like, how dare you call me, I feel unsafe with the things that you're saying, and all you're talking about is racism and imperialism and the thing that happened to your people, and that makes them feel unsafe. And I've never said to anybody that they're responsible for what happened to me or to my ancestors, and is happening to me because of what happened to my ancestors. I've never said that anybody's responsible to that, for that. But but I think it's good for us to all examine how we might continue to uphold some of those practices in our day-to-day language, because it's replete throughout society. So anyway, yeah, I just want to say, like, that particular aspect of this reading really resonates for me because of the experiences I've been having around liberal racism over the past couple of days. Anyway, I'll just quickly wrap up this last bit of the reading. Silencing ourselves in order not to upset the oppressor is indeed an extraordinary act of denial. Yet our colonizers appear to demand nothing less from us in their determination to forget or disguise the past beyond recognition, and in their quest to convince themselves that history has nothing with which to reproach them. All of which seems rather pointless, for as Ward Churchill has rightly pointed out, genocide denied remains genocide, no matter how out of sight and mind of polite society it may be rendered in denial. Yeah, you know, that whole quote of Jenny Shipley's about rewriting history and saying, which is so, you know, mind-blowing, that she was the patron who led out the Cook celebrations, which was literally, you know, rewriting Indigenous history by heroicizing a murderer and land thief, an imperial expansionist, and a syphilitic one at that. And so, you know, that she just took these acts of, that she attacked Tariana Turia in this way, and then wound up becoming, and that is why, and I'll show you guys, if we can, over here, if you can see these behind me, they're actually, I don't know if you can see them, they're little brains. These are my artworks that I did for our Tirohanga Ki Tai exhibition last year, which was, you know, a reference to the view from the shoreline. I don't think you can see, but I'm going to take it right up there and see. Anyway, the brains are named after Jenny Shipley, Captain Cook, and Malcolm McLaren, who is a Gisborne councillor that famously said that Cook should have killed more Māori. He said it in the council chambers. And so for that artwork, I made 3 little pea-sized brains, tiny little colonial brains, and named them after these people that said these horrible things about Māori and Pacific Islanders, and had deplorable ideas about us, and are a part of the misrepresentation of our history. And it was also a mihi to a mentor of mine, somebody that I greatly respect, a valued friend, a matua, an uncle, Moana Jackson, who talks about the ways in which people who did research on us would pickle our brains, and measure our brains and pickle our brains. And they'd measure our brains in attempts to try and prove that we were less intelligent than Europeans because they had bigger brains. Anyway, so it was a mihi to some of his really impactful talks and teachings around the intersection of science and the experience of racist colonial science for Indigenous peoples. And it was also, a reference to those 3 people. We are no. That's the reading for tonight, Ani mi kaere. That's my reflection on it, especially in relation to liberal racism, people who believe that they are, I guess, everybody believes that they're doing the right thing by their own community, or whatnot, but in particular, I've found that people who deem themselves to be liberal progressives just actually have a bit deeper to dig before they get to the truth about the colonialism that they carry as well. Another favourite saying of mine that I learnt from Matua Moana, scratch a liberal, find a racist. And on that note, I'll say good night, everybody. Thursday nights, I'm going to be doing my anti-racism readings. Yeah, so there'll be another one next week. They're generally start at about 7 o'clock if you want to join on, and feel free to leave a message or whatnot on the page. And if you have any suggestions for people that you'd like me to read, feel free to drop those as well. Kia ora no pō Māori.